4,000 years ago, in a mud brick house on the banks of the Nile, a woman needed something most of us never think twice about today, a way to manage her period. No pharmacy, no packaging, no modern products of any kind. So what did she actually use? The honest answer is, we're piecing this together from surprisingly thin evidence, and historians are still debating some of it. Menstruation, across nearly every ancient culture, was rarely written about directly. So what survives comes from a handful of medical papyri, some religious texts, and a fair amount of careful, educated inference. Let's start with what we're most confident about. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents on Earth, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains references consistent with soft papyrus being used as a vaginal plug, essentially an early version of a tampon. Papyrus, the same reed-like plant used to make Egypt's famous writing material, could be softened and rolled into an absorbent form. It was cheap, it was everywhere along the Nile, and it made practical sense as a material. Alongside papyrus, many historians believe soft linen, the same fabric Egyptians used for clothing, was likely used as well, either as an external cloth or folded into a reusable pad. Egypt was a major linen-producing civilization, so the material would have been genuinely accessible to most households, not just the wealthy. Here's where things get genuinely more complicated and more interesting. Another medical text, the London Medical Papyrus, describes a knotted piece of linen yarn, placed internally, accompanied by a spoken incantation invoking the god Anubis and the goddess Taet. But Egyptologists actually disagree about exactly what this passage describes. Some argue it relates to routine menstrual management. Others argue it's specifically addressing bleeding during pregnancy or miscarriage, not ordinary monthly periods at all. This is a genuine example of how translating a 4,000-year-old text is rarely as simple as it sounds. That difficulty shows up again with the ancient Egyptian word for menstruation itself, Hesmen. Some Egyptologists translate it straightforwardly as menstruation. Others point out the same word could also mean purification, and may have applied more broadly to bleeding connected to childbirth or ritual cleansing, not exclusively to a monthly cycle. So even a word we'd assume has one clear meaning turns out to be genuinely debated among specialists. Now, what about how menstruation was actually viewed socially? This is where ancient Egypt looks notably different from several neighboring cultures. Some historical accounts suggest menstruating women may have been temporarily excused from specific temple duties or ritual spaces, tied to ideas about ritual purity, similar in spirit to purification practices required after other bodily events, like childbirth. But it's important to be careful here. This wasn't necessarily framed as shame or punishment the way it was in some later traditions. Egyptian religious life connected menstrual blood symbolically to Isis and to Hathor, goddesses associated with fertility, protection, and the life-giving power of the Nile's own annual flooding. Menstruation, in that framework, was tied to a genuinely powerful natural force, not something to hide out of embarrassment. Compare that to what we know from other ancient civilizations. Greek women reportedly used natural sea sponges. Roman sources mention wool. Different cultures grabbed whatever locally available, absorbent, and washable material made sense in their environment. Egypt's answer, papyrus and linen, was simply the logical extension of what an entire civilization already produced in enormous quantities for completely different purposes. It's genuinely worth pausing here on something easy to miss. For most of history, everywhere on Earth, menstrual management was almost entirely improvised from ordinary household materials, reused, washed, and quietly managed without any dedicated commercial product existing anywhere. Ancient Egypt wasn't unusually primitive in this regard. If anything, the specific historical trace we have, a real medical papyrus describing an absorbent material, is unusually well documented compared to most other ancient cultures, where evidence barely survives at all. That's partly because menstruation, across most of recorded history, simply wasn't considered a topic worth writing down in detail. Historians studying this exact subject point out that we often know more about ancient burial rituals or battle tactics than we do about something that affected half the population every single month. The silence in the historical record isn't really evidence that nothing was happening. It's evidence of what ancient scribes, almost always men, considered worth recording in the first place. So how did ancient Egyptian women handle their periods? With papyrus, likely with linen, quite possibly with practices we still only partially understand from surviving fragments of medical and religious texts, and within a cultural framework that treated the process as connected to genuine spiritual significance rather than pure taboo. It's a genuinely rare thing in ancient history. Real, if incomplete, written evidence of an experience that shaped the daily life of roughly half the population, for an entire civilization, for thousands of years, and yet almost never made it into the history books most of us